We're going to have a presentation by Pam. She's kindly said that we can record this, so we will record this in case any of your colleagues miss it. So I'd love to hand over now to Professor Pam.
Thank you so much, Magistrate Spencer, and thank you to Anne for the invitation to present today. It's a great honour, and it's always a great joy for me as an academic researcher to spend time with practitioners on the ground. I think I still am very much a practitioner at heart, and the favourite part of my work really is knowledge translation work. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting. In my case here in Bendigo in central Victoria, that's the Dja Dja Wurrung and Taugurung peoples. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend a particular welcome to any First Nations members joining us today, and acknowledge, of course, that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, in the presentation today, I'd like to talk about some core concepts that we need to share an understanding of in order to think about language vulnerability in certain populations. So I want to talk, first of all, about what language is. I want to talk about how language development is influenced by the early environment that children find themselves in and why that's important. I'll share with you some of the research that we've done on the language skills of vulnerable adolescents. And here I'm talking about young people in the youth justice system, both on custodial and community-based orders, and young people in out-of-home care in particular. But also we've done some research on young people in flexible alternative education settings, who, as many of you would know, do have some contact in many cases with youth justice and or child protection. So these are not separate populations. I want to talk about the links between language competence and behaviour, and language competence and academic success, how those things all mould in together. We'll touch a little bit on this construct called the school to prison pipeline, and then have a quick look at what makes children's, and when I'm using the word children here, I'm referring to young people. I'm using that term very much in a developmental sense, that young people are, in the eyes of the law, children until the age of 18. In a developmental psychology sense, really young people are adolescents until into their mid-20s, as you're no doubt aware in terms of what we know about brain maturation. So we'll talk about what makes communication skills vulnerable, and also what you can do to minimise that vulnerability in your everyday interactions with young people in the court system. So first of all, oral language. What do we mean when we're talking about oral language? It's kind of everywhere. It's almost literally right under our noses. Oral language seems to hide in plain sight in everyday life. It's not something we give an awful lot of thought to very often until something goes wrong with it. So what do I mean when I talk about oral language? Wearing my speech pathology hat, I'm talking about everyday talking or expressive communication skills. So that's what I'm using at the moment. And also I'm talking about everyday listening, sometimes referred to as receptive communication skills or comprehension skills, and that's what you're drawing on at the moment. So the first key point on this slide is that this is a two-channel process. And when we're asking about a young person's language skills, we need to be thinking equally about their ability to process language used by other people as we do about their ability to produce language themselves. So it's not just about how well they communicate. We also have to consider the other side of the coin, how well they can process, they can take in language that's used by others. And that's often much harder than you might think, because simply asking someone, do you understand, after you've given them a whole lot of complex information, is not a reliable way of ascertaining whether they do actually understand. Every single one of us has on occasion in our lives said that we've understood something when we haven't, perhaps when something was being explained by especially a time-poor medical practitioner, for example. We don't want to look like we're wasting people's time. We don't want to look silly. Someone says, blah, 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 blah. Do you understand? And we say, yes. So it's not easy on the spot to actually genuinely ascertain someone's comprehension of information that's been given to them verbally. So that's one key thing. And the other thing is that language serves a representational function. So language represents mental processes. It's the means by which we get our mental processes out into the world. It's the means by which we share them with other people, whether that's through the spoken word, the written word. Gestural systems are a form of language as well. I'm going to focus today on oral language, but we also have to think about these mental representations. If we didn't have mental representations, we'd be talking about artificial intelligence. So what do we mean by mental representations? Well, all of the things and many more that you can see listed on this slide are examples of mental representations, things that we use language in order to share with other people. One thing we need to keep in mind in relation to language is that it's a messy, complicated business because it's in the hands of humans. Language is something that we have evolved a special facility for as a species, as humans. So we know that, yes, other species can communicate, but I think it's fair to say that no other species on the planet has the complex language system that we have as humans that allows us, amongst other things, to not only communicate about things that are in the here and now. There's a brown bear coming that's going to try and eat us, but we can talk about abstract ideas. We can talk about things that are going to happen in the future. We can talk about things that have happened in the past. So this conceptual aspect of language is really important, but also, of course, language usage changes, and it changes in the mouths and minds of the people who speak a particular language. So the way we're speaking now is different, of course, from how people spoke 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Language is a dynamic, messy kind of creation. And the way that it's used in different social contexts, including the court, varies as well, which can make access to different domains of everyday life more difficult for some young people. Now, if we just think developmentally for a moment, language starts off just with sounds. If we think of what a new baby can produce, human infants are the most helpless infants of all species on the planet. So they have to have vocalization as a way of attracting the attention of caregivers, literally as a matter of survival. But very quickly in the first 6 to 12 months of life, we see that the sounds that infants produce have much more than just a survival imperative. They quickly develop a communication imperative. And we see around the first birthday, between 12, 18 months of age, the emergence of words and word parts. Moving into the second year, we start to see some phrases, then sentences. And then absolutely stunningly and amazingly, by the time children are 5, it really is extraordinary, the complexity of the language that they're able to produce, the connected discourse that they can produce, not only to have everyday conversations, but to share their experiences via narratives, to explain things, so to explain the rules of a game, for example, and to talk about particular topics, expository discourse. So that's important for academic success. As we'll see in a moment, narrative discourse has a particular significance in a forensic context as well. But all of this is really incredible with respect to what happens before children get to school. And that's because oral language has this huge evolutionary advantage over written language. We've only had written language systems for somewhere around 3,000 to 5,000 years. So our brains haven't evolved to spontaneously acquire written language. We've got to go to school to learn those skills. But in the main, we acquire oral language through our immersion in everyday interactions with others. So oral language if you like, gets up earlier in the morning. It gets up earlier in the morning in an evolutionary sense for us as a species, and it gets up earlier in the morning for us as individuals developmentally. But then when children get to school, we're going to build on their oral language skills to develop their academic capacities through literacy. Another important thing to keep in mind in relation to oral language is that it's got this surface or literal level where what we say aligns 100% with what we actually mean. But in many cases in everyday life, there's a discrepancy between the literal meaning of what we say and the intended or to be inferred meaning of what we say. So we make a lot of use of similes, metaphors, idioms, jokes, sarcasm, all of the things that you can see listed on this slide that make our everyday interactions with each other more enjoyable, often inject some humour and make ourselves stop and think and ponder a deeper meaning. But all of these things also, of course, reduce the accessibility of language for people who haven't had prior exposure and experience with this kind of idiomatic, non-literal use of language. For the rest of today, just listen out in any conversations that you have for expressions that people use that are not intended to be taken literally. Don't count your chickens before they're hatched. This stuff comes up right across the day. It really permeates the way that we communicate. But of course, it's problematic for any speaker groups who don't have that level of familiarity and flexibility with these kinds of linguistic devices. So let me show you some examples of how this can look in everyday life, how there can be a discrepancy between the surface meaning and the intended meaning. So I think you would all agree, looking at that picture, you can get a pretty good sense of what's happening with body language there, that there's a big discrepancy between the literal meaning of what the person on the left is saying and the intended meaning. So that's an example of sarcasm, where it's the listener's job to take a statement and turn it around 180 degrees and find a meaning that's the complete opposite of what was actually stated. That's quite conceptually and socially a challenging thing to do, to take something that someone has said to you and work out that they actually mean the exact opposite. How hard can we make communication? What about this one? One of the things that we do in everyday communication is try to maintain face, and we try to help other people maintain face. So sometimes we don't always want to say explicitly that we're annoyed with someone, but we use linguistic devices like politeness conventions to imply that we're annoyed, and then it's the listener's job to pick up that message, to draw that inference. Now, someone on the autism spectrum, someone who's had a brain injury, might not understand that the person on the left, who we might assume is the boss, is actually using a politeness convention here, and might fall into the unintended trap of saying, oh, let me look at your watch, I'll tell you whether it's wrong. And then, of course, they're looking like they're being a bit smart, a bit clever, and they've violated a social rule, because their job was to draw an inference here and to say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, and to acknowledge that they're running late. What about this one? I'm sure some of you have been on the receiving end of a phone call like this at some point in your life, and you will know, and it could be dad, yes, I acknowledge, in my life, I think it's more likely it would be mum, but you know that if you get a phone call like that from your adult offspring, you don't actually answer the question. You don't say, oh, well, I'm got a dentist appointment on Tuesday and I've got some work commitments on Wednesday. You know that there's a deeper intended meaning, and your brain immediately goes there and you say, why? What's happened? So these are just some examples in everyday life of how our literal meaning and our intended meaning can be miles apart, and we can see how tears in the communication fabric occur when listeners and speakers are not sharing the same contract around how they're using language. Now, I said I would just make a comment about narrative discourse. So narrative discourse is the means by which we all share our everyday experiences with each other. So it's incredibly important for friendships. It's a kind of social glue that enables us to, in the case of friendships, have ongoing narratives that we pick up and add to when we catch up with friends. They know the background and we catch them up on what's been happening in our lives. Or we might have had a particular experience, something that happened to us today, and we want to share that with other people. And we do this in a way that follows a kind of template, which is referred to in the literature as story grammar structure. It's not grammar in the sense of where you put commas and full stops. It's a macro for putting things in the right order. So starting off with the setting, the context, and then some kind of initiating event, and then some kind of reaction or response, and then the story resolves itself. Now, narrative discourse is closely related to cognitive development, to memory skills, excuse me, to planning and organisation, and to perspective taking. In children's everyday lives, it's often co-constructed within conversation, but that's very different in a forensic context where young people are asked to produce a narrative on their own. And in fact, best practice interviewing techniques, and I've sent a copy of a paper through to Anne about this, best practice interviewing techniques say that we shouldn't be co-constructing narratives for obvious reasons with children who are witnesses or suspects or victims in the criminal justice system, because we want as untainted a narrative from them as they can possibly produce. But this is a very different experience for children, where in everyday life, and in fact even adults, co-construct narratives. We interrupt each other and we add bits when we're talking. So that's just one way in which communication in the forensic context varies from young people's experiences in everyday life. Narrative emerges in stages. It becomes more complex as children's vocabulary skills and their syntactic skills become more elaborate. So their ability to put together more complete and more complex sentences supports their ability to produce a narrative. And this, of course, has particular relevance in forensic context. So if you don't have very good narrative language skills, either because, well, it could be for a range of reasons, you might not have very good perspective taking skills. You might not be very good at thinking about what the other person already knows. You may not have all of the vocabulary that you need. You may not be very good at putting sentences together. And all of a sudden, your narrative looks a bit thin and it's looking like you're not providing as much information as is being asked of you by an adult in authority, which of course can lead to you looking like you're withholding information and not being as cooperative as the situation, whether it's a police interview or some other kind of formal engagement in the court process. Language keeps company developmentally with a raft of other processes. Of course, it doesn't occur in a vacuum. So language is a wonderful window on children's cognitive, their thinking abilities, their emotional development. The ability to use words to express feelings is incredibly important, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Reasoning, problem solving, predicting, remembering, perspective taking, moving from the concrete to the abstract. Young children are very concrete, very literal, very stuck in the here and now. As they move through late primary school into the secondary years, the ability to think abstractly develops and continues to develop into adulthood. And language is also relevant to what we call metacognition, which is the ability to think about thinking. Many of you who are psychologists and practice CBT, for example, will know that encouraging people to think about their thinking is an important part of that. And also meta-language, which is using language to talk about language, and that's important in an educational context, to be able to use language to talk about language, and it's also often important in a therapeutic context. So when we think about language development and early mental health, what we want to see, of course, is all infants and toddlers being reared in environments where they're looked after by warm, responsive adults, warm, emotionally attuned adults who are good at their own self-regulation and are good at putting the needs of the infant and then the toddler pretty much first. Now, I'm not saying parents have to take this to Olympic lengths and always subvert their own needs. That's not what I'm saying at all. But we do know that because of the level of dependency of human infants and the reliance of the infant brain on interactions for what's called synaptogenesis, so that's the formation of synapses in the infant brain, that's extremely experience dependent. So human infants look for and respond to interactions with others, as you can see in the mirroring that's going on in the photo on that slide. So what we really want to see is a rich volume of serve and return interactions, like a game of tennis. The infant serves, they make a bid for attention, the adult responds, they return play. In other situations, it'll be the adult who serves and the infant who returns play. Those serve and return interactions allow the baby's brain to build mental schema, representations of how relationships work. They form the basis of emotional attunement and secure attachment. And if you emerge from the first 2 years of life with a secure attachment style, that's a gift for life, not just a gift for infancy and toddlerhood. That informs the way you enter into and navigate relationships across the lifespan, how you deal with rejection and disappointment, for example, across the lifespan. So emotional attachment is profoundly important, and it's also profoundly language-based. So when infants are distressed, parents give words to describe their emotional state. They say, oh, you're sad, you're angry, you're upset. So that's the very early organising processes by which infants learn that feelings have words. And if you know that feelings have words, it's easier for you to manage those feelings, to talk about those feelings, and ultimately, of course, to identify those feelings in others. So that's the development, the early stages of emotional empathy and perspective taking. And all of this, of course, maps to social cognition, which I'll talk about in a moment. So there's nothing trivial at all about what goes on in the first 2 years of life with respect to infant mental health and the foundations that are ideally established in the first 2 years of life in laying the foundations for emotional self-regulation and emotional attunement with others. Profoundly important. The first 2 years of life is not just about custodial care, about warmth and being fed and being kept dry and so forth. There's a lot more going on that is of profound importance developmentally. So what's this thing called social cognition? This is our ability to read the play in real time in interactions with other people. Now, this is tricky because in addition to the fact that we like to use language in non-literal ways, we are also socialized from a very early age to play against our emotions. We're socialized to say things that we don't actually mean. We're socialized to say we're having a good time at Great Aunt Maud's 90th birthday when we're actually not. We're actually bored and we'd rather be somewhere else. But we're told that the social convention is that we have to look like we're having a good time and say we're having a good time. And then the job for everybody else is to be able to read the cues and make an assessment as to the level of authenticity of that communication. So successful communicators have good social cognition skills because they can disaggregate what's happening with respect to the verbal cues and the body language, the tone of voice, and everything else about that context. And we've got to be able to do this in real time. And to monitor the effects of other people's cues and our response to those cues in order to keep the interaction on the tracks. In the main, we don't like to cause other people to lose face. In the main, we don't like to create tears in the social fabric. Of course, many of the young people that your work brings you into contact with maybe don't have such well socialized repertoires of behavior around that because of that lack of scaffolding in their early environments. Social cognition skills are highly susceptible to developmental stage, and they're also susceptible to a range of clinical or neurobiological disorders, such as autism spectrum disorder, acquired brain injury, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, intellectual disability. All of those things will impact on a young person's social cognition skills. Now, we can't talk about language without talking about culture, and culture is about much more than just the words that we use. Different cultures have different rules about the degree of speaker autonomy, particularly for children and adolescents. Different rules about turn taking and topic management, who can terminate a topic, who can introduce a new topic. Obviously, different levels of exposure to idiomatic language, as we've already talked about, different non-verbal conventions around eye contact and rules with respect to physical proximity, and different conventions around the relationship between children and adults in conversation. So I just want to acknowledge that most of what I'm saying, I guess, is coming from and most of the research, I guess, on this is perhaps coming from a white Anglo mainstream perspective, but we need to recognise, of course, that Australia is a multicultural society, and of course our own First Nations people have their own set of conventions around much of what I'm talking about today. What we ultimately want for all young people, though, is as they move through childhood and adolescence and into early adulthood, we want them to be what we call pragmatically competent. So we want them to be able to be communication users who can draw from the top jug in this diagram of from their language skills, so their knowledge of vocabulary and sentence structure and all those subcomponents of language. On the left-hand side, we've got executive function skills, so things like attention and concentration and planning and organisation, which many of you will know are subserved by the prefrontal regions of the brain, which are the latest maturing areas of the brain. And then on the right, we've got social cognition function. So all of those things need to be in play. So it doesn't take much for someone to have pragmatic language difficulties using language effectively in everyday social interactions. Of course, we've also got to consider individual characteristics, as you can see on the saucer, and wider social and cultural factors that influence the way communication is used by speaker groups. And that's the plate, if you like, that the saucer's sitting on. But it's not easy to emerge from adolescence and into adulthood being a mainly competent user of language because of all of the skills that we need to draw in and because of the vulnerability of language skills to environmental exposure and neurobiological disorders, as we'll come back to in a moment. We also need to remember, unfortunately, that language skills sit on a social gradient that is evident from the preschool years. So we know that some children experience early home environments that bring them into contact with much richer, more diverse language use, more complex vocabulary exposure to more complex sentences, more exposure to books. So that means that in some cases there can be, a 2-year discrepancy when children enter school, even though they might be the same chronological age. There can be a huge discrepancy with respect to their expressive and receptive language skills. And we know, of course, that incarceration also sits on a social gradient with a huge overrepresentation of young people from disadvantaged communities, more crime-prone communities, and there is, as we all know, a huge and shameful overrepresentation of our own First Nations children in youth justice and indeed also the adult corrections system. So we've got this social gradient problem that applies both to language and also to incarceration. So language, as I said, is something of a paradox in the sense that it has it's evolved in us over time. We've got an evolutionary advantage for oral language, but it's also extremely sensitive. It's sensitive to a large number of developmental conditions that you can see listed there. And it's also sensitive to environmental exposure. So we've got to hold those two competing ideas in mind when we think about oral language skills. Yes, it's a biologically primary or biologically natural thing for children to develop oral language through their immersion in everyday interactions with caregivers, but not all children get to the age 5, or children at the age of 5 are not all equal with respect to the kinds of language exposure that they've had and the kinds of language skills that they take with them to school. Now, I want to focus just for a moment on this thing called developmental language disorder, which Professor Dorothy Bishop at the University of Oxford described a couple of years ago as the most common disorder you've never heard of. It's interesting that this is considerably much more common, as you can see here, than, for example, autism spectrum disorder, which occurs in probably less than 1%, considerably less than 1% of the population. But we've got good population level data to tell us that somewhere around 7 to 10% of children have a developmental language disorder. And that translates into roughly 2 children in every class having a language disorder. This has gone by various different names, as you can see on this slide over the years. Where we've landed through international consensus is on developmental language disorder, or in some cases language disorder. I won't go into the distinction between those two terms now. But language disorders frequently co-occur with other developmental disorders, such as autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, intellectual disability, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. If you've got a child in front of you with any of those disorders, you are almost definitely going to have a child who has a language disorder. But language problems seem to hide in plain sight, and people don't always get a diagnosis, and we don't always develop a full, well-rounded understanding of a young person with respect to their communication needs. But what we'll see today is how that could manifest. So I'm going to get you to do something for me now to get you to have a think about your own language skills. So if you're multitasking at the moment, put down whatever it is that you're multitasking with, because I'm going to give you an instruction. I want you to do something for me. Okay, you're all looking ready. So I want you to pick up your phylodactyphone and place it periplantally along the hyperspondyle aspect of your dipaxon. Okay, jump to it. Now, those of you who I can see are looking a little bit confused. Welcome to the world of the young person with a language disorder. Welcome to what it feels like to be in the court when other people are talking to you and saying things that sound like words that you should understand, and they've told you that they're going to get you to do something and you really want to cooperate because you know that it's important, but for the life of you, you haven't got a clue what's going on. And of course, this is the experience for so many young people with weak language skills at school. And it's not surprising that what we see is that by about grade 3, these are also the kids who have behaviour problems and are not on track with respect to their reading, writing and spelling skills. And if you get to grade 3 and you're falling behind in those key literacy domains, and you're having trouble following instructions in classrooms, you're going to start to become very distracted and off task. And very soon you're going to be referred to a child and adolescent mental health service because of your behaviour difficulties, and maybe, if you're lucky, your academic struggles. Increasingly, we're getting better at thinking about the language skills of those young people, but we've still got a long way to go in that regard. Okay, so you've done my little listening task. Sorry, you were meant to be looking at that slide when I was making you do that task. Okay, so what does all of this have to do with vulnerable young people? Well, I'm sure you're starting to join some of those dots already in your mind. When we think about vulnerable young people in the court system, out-of-home care, who are often one and the same, of course. Many of you would be familiar with the literature on adverse childhood experiences and the fact that all of these things are in play in the lives of young people who have had adverse childhood experiences, who've been exposed to domestic violence, who've been exposed to abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, in some cases sexual abuse. We know that neglect, of course, is the most common and pervasive form of child maltreatment. And all of these things relate to ongoing language development, because language development, as I've said, yes, it's biologically primary, but it needs an awful lot of support from the child's environment, and not just in the early years, all the way through primary years into secondary years. So by the time we're looking at a young person in adolescence who's in contact with the youth justice system, perhaps via the child protection door, what we're seeing in most cases is a very gappy profile with respect to their language development, and an even more problematic profile with respect to their academic achievement, underpinned by their reading, writing, and spelling skills. So if we think about the pathway to youth justice, I think you would agree that all of the factors that you can see listed here are overrepresented in the lives of young people who you work with in the youth justice system. I put in brackets early death because we know that these young people are at a higher risk for death before the age of 21 from a range of causes. And I've highlighted the history of behavioural conduct disturbance because that's the thing that most adults are going to notice. Adults notice behaviour problems because children's behaviour problems are disruptive to the lives of adults. So young people who've got weak language skills, if they're referred into the service delivery system at all, are typically going to be referred because of their behaviour difficulties, not because someone's twigged to the fact that their language skills are lacking and pretty thin. And that's okay to a point. Of course, we want young people to be exposed to service delivery systems, mental health service delivery systems, but only if they're getting a proper developmental assessment. If we're managing language problems via the behaviour handle, then we're not going to be treating the underlying cause in many cases. Now we can look at all of those factors again through a different lens and say, what do they mean for language development? And unfortunately, what we've got here is a perfect storm. Because language has that vulnerability to environmental factors and environmental exposure, all of the things that predispose or create risk for involvement in the youth justice system and disengagement from school and hanging around with similarly disaffected peers, all of those things, when we put them together, also create a huge level of risk with respect to young people's language development. So it shouldn't surprise us, perhaps, that when we look at populations of young people with respect to their language skills, populations of young people in youth justice, we find a huge overrepresentation of language disorders, previously undiagnosed language disorders. So what we've found in our Australian research, and this is a really high-level helicopter overview here, is that about 50 to 60% of young male offenders have a clinically significant yet undiagnosed language disorder that we can't explain away on the basis of low IQ, disability, mental health problems, all of which, of course, are overrepresented, but they don't explain in themselves the high prevalence of language disorder. We find links between language disorder and a past history of interpersonal violence, such that young people who are convicted of more violent crimes are more likely to be diagnosed with a language disorder when we actually go and apply specific measures that are sensitive to that. Higher rates of language disorder in young people who enter the youth justice system via the child protection door. So there's immediate alarm bells going off there with respect to what we need to be doing when children are in the child protection system at an early age, with respect to shoring up their ongoing language development. This stuff is pretty hard to backfill. If a decade's gone by, it gets pretty hard to backfill what should have been happening when children were 3 and 4 and 5 years old. We've also identified higher rates of language disorder in young people from ATSI backgrounds, even when we control for their exposure to standard Australian English. Now, there's a number of caveats here. We only recruited young people into that study who told us themselves that they considered standard Australian English to be their first language. It wasn't necessarily their only language. But we fully acknowledge the fact that we were using measures of language skills that were not designed for First Nations speakers. And although they allow us to identify the level of disadvantage that those young people are likely to face where standard Australian English is the currency, that doesn't mean that had they been assessed in a First Nations context, that their language skill profile wouldn't have looked stronger. So we don't know that, but we do know that there's a particular level of vulnerability when they're operating in a standard Australian English context, for example, in the court system. We've also identified high rates of language disorder in young female offenders, not as high as in young male offenders, but higher than in non-offending females in the community. So what does all this mean in relation to the school to prison pipeline? This is a notion that comes out of the US literature on young people who are underperforming academically, engaging with similarly disaffected peers, performing, start performing very poorly on academic measures by around grade 3, if not earlier, and often then are experiencing suspensions and exclusions at a very high rate. Now, one thing I would emphasise is that in my head, the school to prison pipeline doesn't refer just to literal prisons. I think we need to think about social marginalisation as being a really important form of imprisonment, and it's a less visible form of imprisonment, and it's also not time limited the way a sentence to a custodial setting is. But we do know that where efforts have been made to improve language skills and improve reading success and academic achievement, we can actually clog that school to prison pipeline. We can keep young people connected to school, and keeping them connected to school and academic achievement is a significant way, and it's probably the most impactful way of keeping young people out of that school to prison pipeline. But we've got to act very purposefully around academic achievement, and also in a very granular way, because you can't succeed academically in our education system if you can't read, write and spell. And many adolescents have reading, writing and spelling skills that if you're lucky, at about a grade 2 level. So how can you keep up with the secondary curriculum if you're reading, writing and spelling at a grade 2 level? And you've got all of the shame and embarrassment and resentment attached to academic failure that's really baked on by the time you're 15 and very hard to work through. So let's think then about what makes children's communication skills vulnerable in a general sense. Of course, their developmental stage, which is not necessarily the same as age. They're related, but not necessarily the same. Low socioeconomic status, because we know that there's that gradient around children's language exposure. Like all of us, children perform less well when they're stressed, afraid, anxious, hungry, or tired. But skills that are still emerging are going to be more fragile in the context of those biological needs impacting. Adults not tuning in doesn't help young people's communication skills. The presence of speech sound disorders, often by the time children get to school when they're age 5, they're still mispronouncing some sounds, and it can be difficult for adults who are not familiar with them to process all of what they're saying. the presence of any kind of neurodisability, assume that neurodisability has implications for language and communication skills. That's a much better assumption to make. And if it proves to not be the case, great. But in most cases, neurodisabilities have adverse implications for language skills. The presence of a sensory disturbance, maltreatment of various forms, disrupted schooling, and of course, all of these things are overrepresented in young people who appear before the court. So what's the difference then for how we communicate with young people in everyday life and how that we communicate with them in a legal context? Now, I know that you know these things are very different, but it might be helpful to make these differences explicit. The adults are powerful strangers. The context is new, it's daunting, and it's high stakes. It's stressful, it's confusing, it's anxiety provoking. Importantly, though, it's not a conversation, what goes on in the court context or even in a police interview context. It's got some features that look like conversation. So young people can draw on past experiences a little bit, but in ways that can ultimately almost be misleading for them, because in most situations when adults interact with children, they're trying to scaffold them, they're trying to promote communicative success. But that's not really how it plays out in a forensic context, particularly if we're relying on children's own narrative account of an event that occurred. We want that to be as uncontaminated as possible. So we actually, in a high stakes context, we put young people in what is a very foreign and unusual communication scenario, and then are hoping for their best possible performance. The child, the young person, has very few speaker rights. So speaker rights means who gets to initiate a topic, who gets to terminate a topic, who gets to say that the conversation's over. And any speaker rights that they do have are unlikely to be exercised by a young person. Some other things that make, so some things now that make children's communication skills vulnerable in a forensic context, all of the things that we talked about in the previous slide. In addition to adults adhering poorly to best practice guidelines, and I have sent an article through to Anne that articulates what best practice interviewing guidelines look like. And you can see some examples here of things that we want to avoid doing. Some practices, some interviewing practices with children might initially seem counterintuitive, but we need to remember that children are not miniature adults. So they haven't learned all of those subtle conventions. They don't necessarily have well-developed social cognition skills that allow them to work out what you really mean, what you're really asking when you ask a question. But there are some very helpful evidence-based best practice guidelines for interviewing children. So we want to avoid early and overuse of specific questions rather than open-ended questions, tag questions, as you can see there in an example. Expecting an elaborate response to non-specific questions. So did anything happen? When an adult asks that to another adult, often we will get an elaborate response because the other adult knows that that's the implication behind the question. Children will tend to interpret those kind of questions as a yes-no question, because if we go back to that idea of literal language, that is literally a yes-no question. Did anything happen? Using adult language that's developmentally too complex, as you can see with the example there, using the passive voice, and asking the young person to affirm or refute a negative proposition. All of those things are too linguistically complex and dense. Questions about concepts such as time, distance, size, duration, and frequency, almost impossible for preschoolers. Still very difficult for children in the primary school years. It's really not until the secondary years in many cases that there can be any accuracy and reliability attached to responses to those questions. Questions about another person's state of mind. It's very hard for young children or even older children with neurodisabilities to actually think about another person's thinking. Inferencing requirements, so avoiding those things that we talked about earlier, like idioms and sarcasm and metaphor. Of course, we don't want to be coercing young people to cooperate in an interview and be doing deals. Avoiding wording that's ambiguous. Did John and Dave hide his hat? Well, who's the his refer to here? That's not helpful. We've got to be much more specific than that. And using unnecessarily complex language. Did he continue to touch you after you requested that he stop? That's using higher order, more literate language that we wouldn't use in everyday interactions with children, and so we're not going to elicit a reliable response when we bring it in a forensic context. So we don't want to assume that children are miniature adults linguistically, but the converse of that is that we also don't want to assume that they can't provide reliable responses if we use evidence-based interviewing techniques with fidelity. This is just some examples of common idioms that young people will have difficulty understanding. If we go back to that idea of non-literal language, many of these are quite culturally bound, these expressions. But we do use this kind of language very frequently in everyday interactions, and we need to be mindful of it so that it's not creating a barrier for young people's comprehension. The key thing for us to remember is that language problems are invisible. So young people don't walk into a police station or a courtroom or a DHHS office with a barcode that makes a noise on their barcode on their forehead that makes a noise when they walk into the room that alerts everybody that they've got a language disorder. Instead, language difficulties masquerade as a raft of behavioural phenomena that can then create further layers of disadvantage for the young person. So they can look rude, they can look indifferent, unconcerned, poorly motivated, uncooperative. They'll have trouble keeping up with banter. There's a likelihood that they're going to be more suggestible and overly compliant if they're put under pressure in an interviewing context. They may just get a label of behaviour disturbance. They may get a label of low IQ, even though their IQ is not low because of their language difficulties. And they may look like they're not very genuine or authentic. And of course, that has implications for participation in restorative justice conferencing. Boys with behaviour problems and learning difficulties always need to raise red flags if we want to talk about early identification levers here. I always encourage teachers to think about the fact that behaviour is communication and what can be done about that, and that applies in a forensic context as well. Couple of slides here just summarising some things that you can do to make communication easier in your everyday lives, some strategies that you can employ. But I guess conceptually, I would just encourage you to think about the fact that as skilled communicators, you've got an imaginary communication dial that's got very, very finely graduated settings on it. The young people who you interact with in your work have communication dials that are much blunter, and they're going to need an incredible amount of support and scaffolding in order to succeed and to access just exposure in the justice system and to have their voice heard in the justice system. So there's some freely downloadable papers at the end of the presentation. Sorry to rush there at the end.
Pamela Snow, that was fantastic. Can't thank you enough. All right, take care, and until next time. See you then.